Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Tracy, and if you don't know me, I have a passion for upcycling clothing and I teach sewing on here. I want to give a huge thanks to this week's sponsor, LDH Scissors. LDH stands for Love, Dedication, and Happiness. LDH specializes in high quality sewing tools. They sent me a couple of sewing tools. They carry fabric shears, pinking shears, thread snips, rotary cutters, and everything is super affordable. A great gift idea for the holiday is to get like personalized engraved scissors. They were sweet enough to just like engrave Transformations by Tracy on these shears. I thought that was such a sweet surprise when I opened it. All of the tools were so nicely packaged. I loved that most of the tools were in like cardboard boxes versus like plastic packaging. The rotary tool came with like a really nice pouch just to store it. I already got to use all of these sewing tools and I absolutely loved them. They also sent me a pair of snips. These are always very useful when I'm like trimming threads off any garment. One of my personal favorite tools that they sent me were these. I pretty much just fell in love with like the gold handles on these little snips. LDH has a 10-year warranty on your scissors, and they also offer sharpening support, and they came in this little pouch. LDH is family owned and donates 5% of their profits to Women's Shelters Canada. If you're looking to make a switch in your sewing tools or looking for new sewing tools, I definitely recommend checking LDH out. I have made the switch. It's the best decision I ever made. I hope you guys had a great Halloween. I wanted to share the tutorial on this Empire gathered dress that I created. For my costume, the Mask of Zorro, I was Elena Montero and I kind of wanted to just recreate the garment she wears in the scene where she's dueling Zorro. I made a digital sewing pattern as always, so it's available on my Etsy shop and I have linked it down below. Materials needed for this dress are about 4 to 5 yards of any woven fabric. I used cotton for the bodice of my dress. The place I buy fabric from, which is Fab Scrap, they only had a certain amount of cotton, so the skirt is like a poly fabric that has a slight stretch to it, but you're welcome to use any woven or stretch fabric for this project. I have linked all of the required materials down below. I used some decorative elastic, so I will link something similar. Let's go ahead and get into this tutorial. I start by taking the pattern pieces of the bodice and just cutting those out. So on every pattern piece, I indicate how many you have to cut out. So you need to cut out 2 for each piece just so you have a lining. It is best to line the bodice just so it can actually like hold all of the weight of the skirt. The most efficient way to cut out pattern pieces for me is to just use a pattern weight and just like hold with one hand the pattern piece as I cut using the rotary blade. For the sleeves of the bodice, you only need to cut the right and the left sleeve, so the sleeve just won't be lined. When cutting out your pattern pieces, make sure you are matching up the grain line to the straight grain of your fabric. The skirt for this dress is made up of 3 pieces, so you have the front skirt and then you have the front side of the skirt, which has the slit going down in between those 2 pieces, and then you just have the back skirt. Taking pattern pieces 4 and 5, this is just the front skirt. We're going to start with sewing the slit, so just make sure you have your notches marked. I'm just taking some stabilizing fusible tape. I will link this down below. I got it from Amazon, so it's 1 inch wide and perfect for stabilizing any garment with stretch. I'm just taking this fusible stay tape and then I'm just kind of slashing where I need to if I have like a slight curve. So I'm doing like 1 slash and then I can pivot the tape and then just iron it on the whole seam. Do this until you reach the hem and repeat to the other side. Once you've applied the stay tape from that waistline notch, you can just measure and decide where you want your slit to start. I decided to go down about 8 inches and that's where I wanted my slit to start, but you can always make the starting point longer or shorter. Place right sides together, pin from the top of the skirt all the way down to the starting point of your slit. Take it to the sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way from the top to the starting point of your slit and just back tack. And now you have your front skirt sewn together, so you can see that the seam allowance wants to open because of the slit, so you're just going to fold back the 1/2 inch seam allowance towards each side and just pin all the way down. After pinning the slit seam allowances open, you can just take it to the sewing machine. As I do the top stitch, I'm doing it about 1/4 of an inch away from the previous seam and just going all the way down the slit and just top stitching 1/4 inch. The slit looks so clean, especially with the stabilizing stay tape. Grab your back skirt, and this is pattern number 6. You're going to place the front and the back skirt with right sides together. Take your pins and just pin along the side seam. Just make sure to match up your waist notches and pin from there. Notice that the back skirt at the waist, it is larger due to the fact that we will be inserting elastic into this dress, so we can just slip it on versus having a closure. After you pin the side seams, take it to the sewing machine and just sew 1/2 inch all the way down, and just don't forget to back tack. So I'm using a stretch fabric for the skirt portion of this dress. It doesn't necessarily need to be finished because it won't fray, but since I have an overlock machine, I'm just going to go ahead and overlock the seam allowance of the side seams. Set the skirt aside and we can move on to the bodice. Starting with pattern piece 1 and 2, take your front bodice and your back bodice, placing right sides together, pin at the side seams, and just repeat this to your lining as well. After pinning the side seams, take it to the sewing machine, sew 1/2 inch seam allowance, don't forget to back tack at the start and end. After I sew the side seams, I take it to the overlock machine and just overlock those sides just so the seam allowance doesn't fray, because the bodice fabric is cotton, so it is recommended to overlock those ends. Now you can place shoulder seams together, so right sides together, pin that on the main bodice and the lining. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and overlock. Take the lining of the bodice and turn it right side out so you can see the pretty side facing you, and on the main bodice have the wrong side facing you so you can see the overlocked seams. Take the lining and just tuck it inside the main bodice. Make sure all of your seams are facing each other, so pretty sides are facing pretty sides. You have right sides together. Take pins and just pin along the neckline, pinning the main bodice to the lining. Take it to the sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around the neckline, and don't forget to back tack. And just overlock that seam allowance at the neckline as well. Turn the bodice right side out and push that seam allowance towards the lining of the bodice. Take it to the sewing machine and do an understitch. So an understitch is about 1/8 of an inch away from that seam. I was able to understitch the entire neckline, so just take it slowly because it gets kind of difficult when you reach the shoulder. After you understitch, you can see that the fabric wants to roll under, so it pushes the lining towards the back, and you can just give it a good press. Set your bodice to the side, we can move on to the sleeves. Take your sleeve pattern and make sure that you've marked all of your notches, so the center notch as well as the front and the back of the sleeve, so you don't get confused when you're setting it in. Take your sleeve and fold it in half, line up the side seam and just sew a 1/2 inch all the way down. Don't forget to back tack and make sure you do that to the other sleeve, but make sure it's mirrored image. I went ahead and overlocked that seam allowance. Turn your sleeves right side out, and from notch to notch we're going to do a basting stitch. The stitch size 5, start from one notch and just stitch 1/4 of an inch away until you reach the other notch, and you don't want to back tack. This is the easiest way I find to set in a sleeve. I start by just matching the side seam, so right sides together at the side seam. Then I match up the center of the sleeve with the shoulder seam on the bodice. I take the bobbin thread on that basting stitch we made on the sleeve and start gathering a little bit, but first I line up the notches on the sleeve. So just line up the front notch of the sleeve with the front notch on the bodice, as well as the back notch of the sleeve with the back notch of the bodice, and then just keep pulling that bobbin thread until that sleeve fits around that armhole, and just place pins. And we just want to take it to the sewing machine and sew 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can see it starts to have a little bit of a puff at the shoulder because of all the gathering. You take it to the sewing machine, remove that extra piece from your machine just so you have a narrow piece to actually feed your armhole through. And every few inches that I sew on the sleeve, I keep making sure I lift my fabric and check that nothing is getting caught into the seam allowance. Repeat to the other side and your sleeves are perfectly set in, and you can go ahead and overlock those. The detail I'm doing on this bodice requires this like decorative elastic in order for me to feed ribbon in and out of to have that like front tie look. So this part isn't necessary. You can just make a channel for an elastic and feed elastic through instead of doing the decorative elastic on top. But I'm doing the decorative elastic, so I'm just pinning and starting from the center front of the bodice and just stretching this elastic as much as I can and just stitching alongside the edge of the neckline and the edge of the elastic first. I stitched along the very edge, and now you can see that the bodice at the neckline has started to gather a little bit. From that stitch line, we need to stitch a 1/2 inch away from that previous stitch, so we're just going to stretch and sew the other side down to create a 1/2 inch channel. You want to leave a little opening at the center front. Just taking the elastic and a safety pin and doing that push and pull method to just feed it all the way through. My elastic measured 30 inches and that was like perfect for my neckline, but I do recommend trying it on after you do feed an elastic just to double check that it is tight enough and it's not too loose. When you reach the other end, just overlap an inch and pin your elastics together. Take it to the sewing machine and just do a zigzag and just back tack a few times. After you stitch your elastic together, just stretch out your top and the elastic will pop in. Before I hem the sleeves, I just take it to the overlock machine to just clean finish the ends. Then I fold up the armhole hem up 5/8 of an inch and pin that all the way around. After folding up the armhole hem, just take it to the sewing machine, stitch a 1/2 inch away just to hem the armhole, but you can also leave an opening if you want to just add elastic to create the gathered effect on the sleeve. But I'm just going to take the decorative elastic and just top stitch it onto the hem. I'm marking the center of the sleeve, and that's where my opening's going to be to tie my rib. I take it to the sewing machine and just stitch this trim along the edge, and then I go in on the other side and stitch. So I'm stitching on the scallop versus the part where I need to feed the ribbon through, so just stitch on the other side. Before attaching the bodice to the skirt, just take your bodice at the underbust and just pin the lining and the main fabric together. Take it to the sewing machine and do a basting stitch. So make sure it's at your biggest stitch, size 5, and sew from side seam to side seam, 1/4 inch away. Taking the bobbin thread, start to pull, and you can see that the bodice will start to gather. You want to gather that front underbust to the same measurement as the front of your skirt. So with your skirt right next to it, you can just like keep gathering and measuring until it fits. Once you finish gathering the front bodice, you can take your skirt and your bodice and place right sides together, matching up your side seams. Pin along your underbust all the way around. Before I take it to the sewing machine, I want to just not have all of the pins in the way, so I just take a needle and thread and just baste the bodice and the skirt together. makes my life so much easier when I take it to the sewing machine. So this seam allowance is different. Stitch 5/8 of an inch. Don't forget to back tack. Get to the sewing machine and overlock that raw seam allowance. And this dress is almost done, so you can see that we have a really nicely finished inside garment, but now we can push that seam allowance towards the skirt. By pushing that seam allowance, we are able to create a channel for an elastic at this underbust. So just push the seam allowance towards the skirt. Starting at the side seam, back tack and sew a 1/2 inch from that previous stitch all the way around and leave a 1 inch opening at the side seam so you can feed your 3/8 of an inch elastic. Now there is a channel for you to feed your elastic at the underbust. Take your waist measurement and remove 3 inches for your elastic. So my finished elastic ended up measuring 24 inches. And when you reach the other side, just overlap it 1 inch, pin, take it to your sewing machine and do a zigzag stitch and back tack a few times. And after you sew your elastic together, just close that opening. I take 1/8 of an inch ribbon to feed it through my decorative elastic on my bodice just to give it more detail. So I'm going in and out of this trim and using a bobby pin to do so. And I tie off the ribbon at the center of the hem of the sleeve. And I repeat this to the neckline of the bodice, but the bow ends up being at the center front of the bodice. You can hem the dress any way you want. I recommend doing it the same way we hemmed our sleeve. And your dress is complete. I hope you guys enjoyed the Empire Gathered dress tutorial. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really is the best way to support your favorite creators for free. If you use my sewing pattern, don't forget to tag me on Instagram. I love to see and share your designs. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.